Hello. So in this video, I want to discuss history and also media perception of history and some of the issues around that. Now, I've just been watching a film, Letter to Brezhnev. This is a British romantic comedy set in Liverpool in the mid-80s. It was made in 1985. The title is slightly misleading because Leonid Brezhnev actually died in 1982. The film's presumably set when it was made, 1985. And basically, it's about these two young women from Kirby, which is a satellite town of Liverpool, who have a relationship with two Russian sailors one night. Now, one of them falls in love. Possibly both of them fall in love with these Russian sailors, but the catch is he has to get his ship the following day and go back to the Soviet Union. She's fallen in love with him, so to get out of her working class life, she actually writes to Leonid Brezhnev and she gets a reply. Brezhnev sends her tickets to go to the Soviet Union, and that's where the film ends up. It's an interesting film. It's quite an unusual film, but it's watchable. I'd recommend it. Definitely a bit unusual. There's a lot of statements there about the idea of breaking away from your surroundings and so on. A few Cold War um, pieces of commentary going on in there too. There was an interesting scene where the Foreign Office Minister tried to dissuade her from going to the Soviet Union, and he made the point that the difference between them, i.e., a communist system, and us is that we can't stop you from going. So the point was he was trying to persuade her not to go, but it's freedom of the individual, etc. Anyway, as I do, I got sort of looking into the film. I looked up some archive footage of Leonid Brezhnev, came across a video of Brezhnev and Nixon sort of sharing a joke at their joint meeting, pretending to be like schoolboys cheating in an exam. It was very funny, actually. Very. I think Nixon and Brezhnev shared a similar sense of humor. Um, but then I got looking at other things. One thing led to another, and I came across an RT report from 2015. And that year, there was very big commemorations in both Russia and in China to mark, at that time, 70 years since the end of World War II. Now, there was not one but several different reports that were having a swipe at the West for, as they saw it, understating the role that Russia played. So I want to talk a bit about this because it's very important. Let's be very clear, during World War II, Russian losses, military and civilian, were catastrophic, absolutely hard to even fathom. It's estimated about 8.7 million Soviet soldiers and many millions more civilians. The total number of dead from the Soviet Union, now bear in mind this includes what are now independent countries like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, the Georgian Republic, and so on. Um, Anywhere from 20 to 27 million people. Many of them would indeed have been Russians, being the largest constituent nation of the Soviet Union. That's incredible. I mean, to put that in context, that's like the entire population of a middle-sized country today. 20 million to 27 million dead. That's astonishing. The second highest figure, I'm going to read out the top 10. This is from Wikipedia, which admittedly probably isn't the strongest source, but it's accumulation of different sources. The second highest figure was the People's Republic of China. Um, China, as it then was, it is important to differentiate because the People's Republic, i.e., as the communist state we know today, came about in 1949. So this is actually the China that was controlled at that time by the Kuomintang. But as it entered World War II, China had been coming out of a very bloody civil war, which was pretty much put on a stalemate during the war years, and then it resumed after the war. So actually, Mao and the communists took a lot of credit for the victory over the Japanese, but in fact, the nationalists had enormous losses. The Kuomintang Chinese resistance had enormous losses, and the communists have never really acknowledged that, which is very sad in a sense. But that their losses, the Chinese losses, are estimated between 15 and 20 million. Again, very high, but China had a much bigger population than the Soviet Union, so proportionally it was lower than the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, very, very high. Germany is actually ranked third. In the Second World War, German losses were huge. Total losses for Germany, bearing in mind they were fighting two major wars on two fronts. It's estimated 6.9 to 7.4 million people. That's huge in proportion to Germany's population. I believe that works out at something like a sixth of the entire population. Poland fourth, 5.9 to 6 million. Then the Dutch East Indies, which is present day Indonesia, 3 to 4 million. Japan, 2.5 to 3.1 million. Now, bear in mind a lot of these are official figures, so the true figures may be higher or lower. Um, Japan, especially, the true figure could be higher because of the Japanese nature in the war to, see defeat as dishonoring the nation and so on. So they may well have mitigated casualty figures. India, which was then part of the British Raj, suffered anywhere from 2.5, 1.6 to 2.6 million dead. Yugoslavia, um, anywhere from 1.27 to 1.7 million dead. French Indochina, which is present day Vietnam, and I believe it included Thailand at the time, or actually Thailand was occupied by Japan. French Indochina, the losses were 1 to 2 million. Now, I'm going to go, there's other countries there, of course. I'm going to go to the United States and the UK, which are the two Anglo uh, countries in the Second World War. I include Australia and Canada if I can. Well, United Kingdom, this figure actually includes the British colonies, so presuming at that time that's total figures for the whole empire. Um, Actually, no, it does list Australia and Canada separate. If you just bear with me for a second. So, the figures for the United States, World War II, just below the United Kingdom and above Lithuania, the total number is 419,400. The United Kingdom, 450,900 dead. Now, that's a lot of people, but it's half of the figure of World War One. Although it is fair to say that more British civilians died in World War Two than World War One. I believe we lost something like 69,000 civilians, mostly from air raids. The United States was overwhelmingly military losses, but there were some civilians killed as well. Um, so that's interesting. Now, Canada and Australia, just to put things in context, um, Canada total World War Two losses 1,600. Um, excuse me. No, the total losses for Canada were 43,600, and for Australia 40,400. This is World War Two losses. Now, the claim that RT makes is that the Soviet losses, the Russian losses, are undervalued by the West, and they make the claim. They even had this historian quoting that the Soviet Union alone could have won World War Two. Well, there's a few things I want to comment regarding this. Number one, it goes without question that the Soviet losses, even pro rata in proportion to the population, were far, far, far higher than British and American losses. That's true. And it's something that we should always remember. But the insinuation attacking the West for this implies that there has been no recognition of their casualties. Well, there has been hundreds of films made in the Soviet Union and consequently Russia about World War II, about the Great Patriotic War. They're all from a pro-Russian perspective. There have been a few Hollywood films that are looking at the Russian perspective, Enemy at the Gates with Jude Law, a few others. I would agree that Hollywood probably has valued the Russian sacrifice. But what I resent about RT is once again they're using this as a way to have a go at the West. They've always had an anti-Western agenda. There's no question about that. And only a complete fool would look at RT and really look at it objectively and honestly try to argue that there was no anti-Western perspective there. There clearly is. So I remember at that time, RT was very critical of the West. For example, they said, why are Western leaders not at this huge military parade in Beijing? Well, that's precisely why. Because the Chinese government was using it as an excuse to show off the PLA. Ostensibly, it was about World War II commemorations. Like I say, China also suffered enormous losses. But the real purpose of that was, in my opinion, a facade. The real purpose was to show off the military because of tensions in the South China Sea. And I have no doubt the people at RT are well aware of this. They just will find any opportunity they can to criticize Western leaders over anything. So their question is why does the West think that Britain and America alone won World War II? Well, my response to that is, of course, the war cannot be credited to Britain and America alone. There were many very brave resistant fighters in all the occupied countries who really took major risks, sacrificed in the thousands, and whose sacrifice needs to be remembered. But actually, as a Briton, I sometimes feel there is sometimes an American centric perspective on World War II. Certain Americans think that because their country was involved in the war, they alone won it. I'm going to say something here, and maybe people will accuse me of bias, but so be it. I do feel as a Briton, it needs to be remembered that actually, among the major powers in the European theatre, it was Britain that stood alone in 1940. These are the facts. The United States hadn't entered the war at that point. Pearl Harbor hadn't occurred. Roosevelt was trying to get, I think Roosevelt wanted to move on it, but he was being prevented by Congress. It took Pearl Harbor to bring America into the war. The Soviet Union hadn't been invaded until Operation Barbarossa, 1941. That's what shifted balance. That's what, infuriated Stalin because he saw it as a betrayal of the Russian-German pact, actually. So, yes, it's important that we remember the Russian sacrifice, but had Germany not invaded Russia, the idea that the Soviet Union would have had any sort of moral campaign to save the Jews from Auschwitz, that there would have been any sort of motivation for them to get involved for that reason, is certainly not true. I mean, don't forget the Jewish people suffered horrendous pogroms in the Soviet Union and the old Tsarist Empire um, before that. So when Russia, at least the Soviet Union successor state, kind of tries to claim this moral credibility in World War II, um, certainly in terms of sacrifice, they have a right to say, we suffered enormously and it shouldn't be forgotten. But let's not forget, for countries like Poland and the Baltic states, they were enslaved by both the Nazis and then the communists afterwards. They were absolutely enslaved by both sides. They didn't get a break. Firstly by the Third Reich in World War II, and then by the Soviets in the post-war years, and by communist suppression. So RT conveniently ignores issues like that. I mean, it's not that RT will ever portray Russia in any sort of critical light ever. Because make no mistake about it, RT is motivated by ultranationalism. That's a fact. So they will never ever mention the persecution committed by the Soviet Union. So that's what I find a little bit galling about their perspective on this. The fact of the matter is, among the major powers in the European theatre, Britain stood alone. And I'm not mitigating the role that resistance movements and politically, geographically smaller countries played, and I don't mean that to be disrespectful. But the fact of the matter is, among the great powers, i.e., those powers at Yalta, those powers at Tehran, Britain stood alone in 1940. Now, this is irrefutable. I believe in Britain sometimes we underestimate the role of the empire. We should never, for example, forget the sacrifice of the Indian troops, of the Canadians, of the New Zealanders, the Australians, the South Africans. Um, so that's something perhaps we're guilty of. But one thing, I'm going to make a film review probably about Dunkirk. But one thing I like about that film is, for once, it's actually shown the British perspective. Many World War II films are from an American perspective. So RT, they're making this issue about British American bias. It's actually, if anything, it's more American bias. But why shouldn't Hollywood, which is an American film industry, make films about the American perspective? I mean, if RT's so pissed about it, why don't they put pressure on the Russian film studios to make films about Russia's role in World War II? I find it interesting that the whole world expects Hollywood to cater for the whole world. Hollywood is the world's biggest, most famous at least. I think Hollywood's bigger in terms of like numbers, but it's certainly the most famous film studios in the world. But why is it the world always expects Hollywood to be totally utilitarian? In the end of the day, it's an American-based film studio, so of course they're going to have an American bias, just like Russian cinema has a Russian bias, British cinema has a British bias, Indian cinema has an Indian bias, etc. Anyway, the point I'm driving at here is that there are a lot of things said about World War II, and it was arguably the biggest event in human history, certainly the biggest conflict in human history. But as an event, it was the biggest event in human history. It's going to be debated for eternity. I do believe that anyone who looks at this event needs to recognize just how much the Soviet Union suffered. So I've no issue with that being brought up. But what I do have an issue with is the cynicism of RT to use that as an excuse to just bash the West. I mean, I despise RT, to be quite honest. I just find it incredibly galling. They actually had a video where their correspondent was going around the streets of New York City asking people, oh, who do you think won World War II? Their agenda was obvious. They nitpicked the responses, so they got people to just come out with ignorant answers, and they only chose those answers so that they could say, oh, look at these ignorant Americans. RT, I would argue, is racist would be the wrong word, but I think there's deep xenophobia in its agenda because they are always trying to make Americans and to some extent Europeans look like ignorant xenophobes, when in actual fact they're the ones who are the xenophobes. RT is a disgrace to journalism. I detest it, and this video isn't just about RT, but I would urge people, if you're looking at those sort of videos, I'm not saying that what they're saying is factually wrong. I'm saying that they are doing it for a particular agenda. It isn't really about Hollywood's portrayal or lack of portrayal of the Russian role in World War II. It's about, once again, trying to make the West look bad. And I'm sick of it. That's what RT is all about. So those are just some things to go on. World War II was catastrophic. Anywhere from 60 to 80 million people died. It was the biggest event in human history. And it's absolutely understandable that from a Russian perspective, they would want that to be remembered. But I think the angle that RT is taking is basically just to bash the West. I mean, put it this way, you could argue how many Russians know the details about Dunkirk? How many Russians know about the Blitz? Maybe some do. But those events are not going to be very well documented in Russia. Russians aren't going to see films about D-Day and the Normandy landings and the Blitz. So the fact that Russia suffered the most overall number of casualties shouldn't be forgotten, but RT is utterly pathetic in the sort of cynical way it is using this to push its political agenda today. Actually, I think it's disgusting. That's what RT is all about. It's a nationalist mouthpiece. It will never ever say anything negative about Putin, and it will never ever say anything critical about Russia, ever. And I find it unfortunate that so many people cannot see what is blatantly obvious. Anyway, I'll leave it there. These are just my candid thoughts. You don't have to agree with me, but that's how I feel about it. RT once again showing its anti-Western agenda.